This is the Father Aaron Pembleton Lecture. Father Aaron, whose office I now occupy, here when it was Quincy College. You were here when it was Quincy College. Oh. Yeah. Gotcha. Gotcha. Father, I am now the endowed chair, the Father Aaron Pembleton Chair in history. This is taken from his obituary. You see, he was not only taught history, but also French. He was ordained in the St. Francis Catholic Church in Illinois. And I believe he died, was it 1995? I believe it is. And Dr. Mauder was telling me a story before the lecture tonight that Father Aaron had a student come to him. And the student wasn't doing very well in this class, and he asked Father Aaron, how can I do better? And Father Aaron looked at him and asked, well, have you ever tried studying? And apparently the student said, well, not that. Is there something else I can do? I can relate to that. I'm honored to be the Father Aaron Chair. I'd like to thank Dr. Manning for all his help. I'm grateful tonight for my colleagues being here, Dr. Mauder, Dr. Capillo, Dr. Manning, Dr. Ward, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. As part of the Pembleton Chair, I required to give a talk on my current research. I don't really consider a requirement as much as an honor, and as Dr. Mauder could tell you, I actually like talking about Richard Nixon. And that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Nixon, a new look at his legacy. I am currently at work on a Nixon biography. I have always been interested in Nixon ever since I was a child. I remember when I was a kid, when it was cold out, we had a basement. I used to throw a ball and play games down there, and my parents had a book. It was this massive book, and it was a transcript of Nixon's tapes. And I started reading it as a kid, and I started asking my mom questions. And I became very intrigued by Nixon. And I remained so. He's obviously one of the most controversial figures in American history. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of his life. This is him with a picture of his mother, Anna Nixon. She was a Quaker. His father, Frank, they had 5 children, 5 boys, 2 of whom would die at a very young age. Richard was born on January 9, 1913. His father ran a grocery store. Nixon got accepted to some colleges in the East, but during the Depression, he could not afford to go out there, so he attended Whittier College while continuing to work at the family's grocery store. He then graduated from Duke Law School. He married Pat Ryan in 1937. Originally, during World War II, Nixon worked for the Office of Price Administration in Washington, D.C. As a Quaker, he had an automatic exemption from serving in the military. But he decided to join against his mother's wishes, and he served in the Navy during World War II. After World War II, Nixon returned to California and practiced law. Then he was approached in 1946 to run for Congress in his district in Southern California. Now, I'm going to be talking in my biography about some of the myths, some of the things that have sprung up about Nixon that still kind of persist. Like, for example, during World War II, he played a lot of poker and he won. And one of the myths that grows up is that he used the poker earnings to finance his campaign for Congress in '46. Actually, he used the poker winnings to buy a house. In 1946, when he got a call from a Republican who said, "Are you interested in running for Congress?" And the man asked Nixon, "Are you a Republican?" And he gave a Nixonian answer. He said, "I voted for Dewey in 1944. He didn't say he was a Republican. He said, "I voted for Dewey." I find that little anecdote interesting, that he didn't come out and say yes. He said, "I voted." But anyway, that satisfied them. He got the nomination in 1946. He ran against a man, Jerry Voorhees, and easily won in a race that, again, I'll be talking in my book, which I'll hope you will read and buy, or buy and read, that Voorhees later portrayed himself as kind of a victim of Nixon when, quite honestly, in 1946, Voorhees didn't have any chance of getting reelected. It was a Republican year. Interestingly enough, in 1946, that's the first year JFK got elected to Congress, in '46. 4 years later, Nixon runs for the Senate. In between then, he makes his name. When in 1948, he is serving on a congressional committee, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and a man, Whittaker Chambers, appears before the committee and tells the committee that he himself, Chambers, was a communist, and so was a former State Department official, Alger Hiss. It is Nixon's dogged pursuit of Hiss, or at least as Nixon tells the story, his dogged pursuit of Hiss, that led eventually to Hiss being convicted, not of treason, but of perjury, for denying knowing Whittaker Chambers and other things under oath. In 1950, he runs against Helen Gahagan Douglas, a former actress. This is a race that, again, becomes part legend. It was a very tough race. Douglas gave as good as she got. Nixon won by an overwhelming margin. Again, it was a Republican year. But Nixon employed tactics in that race that would come back to haunt him the rest of his life. By 1950, he had made a name for himself nationally. He was an uppercomer. He was just 37 years old. was a national figure, but already an extremely controversial one. Harry Truman had already grown to detest Nixon by this point, something that Truman would hold for the rest of his life. Just 2 years later, in a rather meteoric rise, Nixon is nominated to be Dwight Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. His candidacy is almost derailed when a newspaper prints stories that Nixon had a slush fund. Nixon then goes on national TV to defend himself and says no matter what happens, he and his family are going to keep the dog Checkers that were given to him. The Checkers speech, as it is known, helped save his career, keep him on the ticket. In 1960, he runs against Kennedy. There weren't, the most famous debate is the first debate, but there were 4 debates in total. By the second, third, and fourth debate, Nixon was wearing makeup and darker suits. He learned his lesson. He loses an extremely close race to John F. Kennedy in 1960. There's a new book out about it. I just reviewed it. In 1962, he loses a gubernatorial election to Pat Brown. His career seems over. He tells the assembled media they won't have him to kick around anymore. And he moves to New York to be a lawyer. He had no intention of quitting politics. Perhaps the most remarkable comeback in political history. He wins the Republican nomination in 1968. He goes on to defeat Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. He's reelected in 1972, the same year he went to China. I was telling my class today that before he died, Nixon mentioned to an aide, I might have created a Frankenstein. This is him, the wall with the Secretary of State, William Rogers. It looked as if Nixon was going to be a very good president, if not a great one. But less than 2 years after his re-election, his administration is engulfed in the greatest scandal in American history. And on August 9th, 1974, he becomes the first and only president to resign. Now, after leaving office, he moves back to California. For those of you old enough to remember, he called it the Western White House in San Clemente. The house he lives in recently sold for $65 million. He wrote his memoirs, ironically, without the help of White House tapes. He had first started taping his conversations for posterity. So when he wrote his memoirs, he would have tapes to help him write and show what a great president he was. Well, it didn't quite work out the way he hoped. He publishes his memoirs, RN, in 1978. He moves to New York City in 1979 and spends the rest of his life writing books and trying to rehabilitate his image. This is a photo taken at the White House in 1981 after the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. I show this photo, the body language is fascinating. You have 4 presidents there and 1 vice president, 3 of whom at that point really don't like each other. And you can tell by the body language. Ford and Carter weren't speaking. Ford didn't like Reagan. Carter was angry that he lost to Reagan. So the only person talking to all of them at that point was Nixon. Today is April 21st. Nixon died on April 22nd, 1994, at the age of 81. His wife, Pat, had died the year earlier in 1993. Tonight's talk is about his legacy and my book and my evaluation of him. Now, after the past couple of decades, C-SPAN, when a president departs office, C-SPAN polls historians asking them to now rank the presidents. The latest that came out, as you see here, I always tell my students to proofread, and I didn't do it myself. I have them here raked as 31st. I would penalize my students if they turned in something like that. He's ranked 31st out of 45, which, when he resigned, he was the 37th president, the surveys taken shortly after he resigned had him 35th, 36th. So he's gone up. Historians have judged his presidency still to be largely a failure because of Watergate. But at the same point, they're giving him higher marks in areas where you would not have previously believed that. And in these polls, presidents go up and down. We have Dr. Ward here with us tonight. He's a Civil War historian. One president recently who has seen his stock elevated tremendously is President Ulysses S. Grant. Because historians have gone back and looked and said this man, Grant, was particularly strong on civil rights. They would say, Dr. Ward, that he helped crush the Ku Klux Klan for the time. The old view that he was a do-nothing president who presided over a corrupt administration, though he was not himself corrupt, has kind of gone by the wayside. Now, he wasn't a president, but the man who Grant has always been compared to in history, Robert E. Lee, Grant is going up, Robert E. Lee is going down. And you see in Charlottesville, Robert E. Lee's statue has been taken down. Grant's standing, gone up. Another president who is now ranked 5th is Dwight Eisenhower, which 60 years ago in 1962, historians would have scoffed at because they believed that Eisenhower did nothing for 8 years except play golf and nap, and that he was a figurehead. He let his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, run foreign policy. But the view now, however, of Eisenhower was that he was in control over everything, that unlike his successors, he didn't get enmeshed in Vietnam, that when he left office there was a balanced budget, there was peace, there was prosperity, there was almost no corruption except the guy got a mink coat, that Eisenhower was far stronger on civil rights than anyone would have believed. So assessments of presidents change, and one of the things that historians now, one of the criteria here is viewed in the context of their times. Nixon's time was obviously very turbulent with Vietnam and Watergate, but historians have also gone back and looked and said, well, you know what? He actually was more progressive in some areas than we had realized. Whereas at the same point in time, Nixon based his historical reputation on his foreign policy achievements. Historians are now re-examining that maybe the opening to China at the time wasn't the best thing. Maybe you did create a Frankenstein. And your rapid approachment with the Soviet Union only prolonged the Soviet Union's life. It's an interesting analysis. Now, why is there a need for a new Nixon biography? There have been plenty. Well, I want to write one. It's a joke, okay? I believe that this, this judging within the context of his times, and also now, so far removed, 2 generations removed from Watergate, a balanced assessment of Nixon could add to his historical evaluation and help us better understand the current state of politics. This photo here is one of my favorites. Nixon would put his feet up on the desk. And in the Oval Office are H.R. Holloman and John Ehrlichman. Kissinger is not there. Anyway, the night before Nixon resigned, he spoke with Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger was always the courtier. And he told Nixon, history will treat you more kindly. To which Nixon replied, that will depend on who writes the history. There have been, since Nixon appeared on the national level, scores of biographies about him. The first biographies were overwhelmingly positive. They were written kind of by insiders. You can see there the one on the left by Earl Mazo, who was friendly to Nixon. Nixon himself could never stop writing about his own life, and it started in 1962 when he wrote a book, Six Crises. He wrote this book in between losing to Kennedy and running for governor of California. Like all of Nixon's books, it's written by him. He did not have ghostwriters. It's technically, even one of his critics said technically perfect, but like with everything Nixon, it's self-serving. And oftentimes, when you read something written by Nixon, what is more important is what's left out than what's actually in there. Presidential memoirs are perhaps the lowest form of genre in American writing. Except, again, Ulysses S. Grant, which he wrote, dying of cancer, is considered and probably always will be the best. Ironically, Nixon had to write less of a self-serving memoir because of Watergate. And he had to present everything that had happened, but then, of course, he offered his own spin on it. He spent about 2.5 years writing this in California in exile. It's close to 1,000 pages. It begins, I was born in a house my father built. And his father did build it. I don't know if any of you have been to the Nixon Library in California. I have. His father ordered parts from Sears Roebuck and built the house. And you can go in there. They moved it, but it's the site of the Nixon Library today. There are certain things in the memoirs that Nixon is forced to confront. So, for example, one of the reasons why he had to resign was because two of his men, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, who incidentally there's going to be a new Netflix series about them, which I'm debating whether or not to watch, broke into the office of a psychiatrist, Daniel Fielding, because Fielding had a patient, Daniel Ellsberg, who had leaked what became known as the Pentagon Papers. They were looking for dirt on Ellsberg to discredit him. This was in August of 1971, a few months after the leak. They broke into the office, they dressed as bums to conceal their identities, and went looking for Ellsberg's file, which wasn't there. Being the bumbling idiots they were, they took photos of it. And they showed it to White House assistant John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman, an officer of the court, a member of the bar, had a responsibility to inform him. He didn't. Well, in his memoirs, Nixon writes about that break-in. And he writes, I don't recall if I knew of the Ellsberg break-in beforehand. Now, Nixon had started taping his conversations months before. His Oval Office, his hideout in the Executive Office Building, his phone conversations, even up at Camp David. No tape has ever come out to show that Nixon approved of this. But he kind of hedges here, saying, I don't recall. Nixon had an excellent memory. He tended not to forget anything. So, did he give the okay to the break-in? This one? Now, the second one, this photo, this is the last one, was taken on June 23rd, 1972. For students of Nixon, that date is very significant. That was 6 days after the Watergate break-in. This is a Friday, and earlier that morning he had spoken with H.R. Holloman, his chief of staff, about the Watergate break-in. Now, I always tell my students that there's no evidence that Nixon knew about the Watergate break-in beforehand. That was not the issue. The issue was that Hunt and Liddy were in charge of the Watergate break-in, and they had broken into Ellsberg's, Fielding's office. Nixon did learn about that break-in afterwards. That's what Nixon was worried about. When he approves the plan of telling the CIA to tell the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation. That's why he's doing it. Over time, really beginning in the late 1980s, some historians began to reevaluate Nixon's presidency. In particular, there were two authors, Stephen Ambrose, who wrote a 3-volume biography of Nixon, and then Tom Wicker, a former New York Times columnist, both of whom had been vociferous critics of Nixon while he was president. They began to reevaluate him because during the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president. And Wicker, a liberal from the New York Times, began to say, as others did, geez, maybe Nixon wasn't so bad compared to Reagan. There was a book by Joan Hoff that came out in 1994 called, very simply, Nixon Reconsidered, in which she argued, in fact, Nixon was a progressive president. She pointed to things such as his establishment of the EPA. In 1970, his State of the Union address, his theme was environmental reform. And there was a book on Nixon's civil rights that argued that Nixon was the one who went in at 15 years after Brown and oversaw the peaceful desegregation of Southern schools, that he began affirmative action. Others pointed to the fact that Nixon had called for guaranteed health insurance for all Americans. Remember, his two brothers had died of tuberculosis, and that almost bankrupted the family. There was a new challenge to that, saying, no, you're overdoing it. You're simply going back and saying because Reagan was a conservative, you don't like him, Nixon, because that's not true. These two authors, Erwin Gelman, John F. Farrell, if you read these two books and say on Nixon's 1950 race against Helen Gahagan Douglas, or the 1960 campaign, it's extraordinary how two authors can study the same event and reach different conclusions on virtually every single thing. Gelman is in the midst of a 5-volume biography of Nixon. The third one was just published on the 1960 campaign. He's still got 2 more to go. There's another guy who writes about Lyndon Johnson called Robert Caro. He's been doing the 5th volume. He keeps saying it's coming. I'm waiting for it. Farrell's was a single version, but if you are interested in Nixon, again, these are 2 completely contrasting views. Farrell kind of takes the traditional approach that Nixon was a flawed human being, that he was dishonest, that his presidency was a failure, that he really wasn't a liberal, that Watergate was the worst scandal in American history. Gelman counters that everything you've learned about Nixon is either a lie or a myth. What am I going to do? I've decided to write kind of a standard but non-traditional approach. instead of hunting down every source, going to every library, what I'm going to actually do is concentrate this biography from the beginning of Nixon's life to the end by using Nixon's, what he wrote and what he said as my sources. And then, this is what Nixon said, this is what Nixon wrote, this is what actually happened. There tends to be a divergence sometimes. And then I'll offer a perspective on his legacy while trying to offer my own perspective on some of the things that I think history has gotten wrong. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Dr. Mauder is here. And Dr. Mauder and I, over the last 15 years, have had plenty of conversations about Nixon and his legacy. And we don't tend to see eye to eye very often. Dr. Mauder is an Air Force veteran, and Nixon was a Navy veteran. And one of the things that Dr. Mauder and I have discussed is Nixon in Vietnam. One of where Dr. Mauder and I do agree, and we have fun with this, is there are hundreds of sayings that are attributed to people in history who there's no evidence these people said these things. The best example is Marie Antoinette, "Let them eat cake." Well, with Nixon in Vietnam, I still read all the time when I'm reading stuff about Nixon that Nixon said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. No, he didn't. He never said that. What occurred was in 1968 when he was running for president, a reporter read a wire transcript of something Nixon had said in New Hampshire, transcribed it saying Nixon said he had a secret plan. And it just became part of history when he never actually said that. Or when he ran against Helen Gahagan Douglas in 1950, that he said she's pink right down to her underwear. No evidence that he said that. Again, this matters because of understanding the current state of politics. And I often show my class, things that Nixon was talking about reverberate today. But I'm trying to set the historical record straight. So, again, one of the things that I always read is that Nixon had a Southern strategy. I'm doing that, I just did. Nixon always denied having a Southern strategy. The belief was that Nixon created a strategy to go in to appeal to white Southerners based on his opposition to segregation, his opposition to desegregation, and he used code words and other things to have a Southern strategy. Well, Nixon has the most documented administration in this country's history. First of all, he wrote everything down. Second, from 1971 onward, all of his conversations were taped. There's no document anywhere that's ever been produced or anything on a tape that says Nixon's Southern strategy. I contend that's largely a myth, so that when in 1968 he ran for president, he ceded the Deep South to George Wallace. Again, Dr. Waters from Mississippi. George Wallace won Mississippi in 1968. Nixon never campaigned there. I will also, again, be, as I mentioned, there are a lot of things that Nixon simply omits. He doesn't confront, even though he wrote all of these books. There are a lot of things he just simply will not touch. He shies away from. The kind of things that made him look bad. Further, again, looking back 50 years, you know, he believed his legacy, he hoped, would be visiting China. Was that really such a great accomplishment? At some point in time, the United States and China were going to open relations. And further, you can argue it was Nixon's the one who delayed it, because Lyndon Johnson himself said, if I go to China, Nixon will call around calling me a traitor. And he accelerated China's development to the point where China right now is obviously so strong, and the United States and China have very testy relations. Again, going to the Soviet Union, did he merely prolong the Soviet Union's existence? Particularly, Madeline was here today. She's a student of mine. I was telling them what he did was he sold grain and wheat to the Soviet Union in the 1970s at a time when they desperately needed it. The peace that he hoped to achieve in Vietnam didn't hold, unlike the one Eisenhower achieved in Korea. So was he really that great a foreign policy president? Then he talked about silent majority and other things. That along in 2016, a Republican candidate for president said a lot of the things that Nixon said. I'll evaluate that. I'm making progress on this, and I hope to be done by August of 2023. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do this and holding the Father Aaron Pembleton Chair. Extremely grateful for all of you who came out tonight. And my favorite part of any talk, always in class or here, is taking questions. And I would like to take your questions now. And Ryan has a microphone for anyone. Anyone have questions? Yeah.
I got the microphone first,
Yeah.
Sorry. First of all, thanks for your talk. Wonderful. I'm excited to read it. Buy it, then read it, of course.
Thank you. Thank you.
Speaking of books that we buy and then read or may not read, there's a biography of Adams John Adams called A Party of One, I believe is the name. And thinking about Nixon, as I've heard you discuss tonight, that seems like a title that would be much more fitting of Nixon. He seems to be this very singular study in paradox when it comes to American presidencies. What exactly was Nixon's relation to party politics? Was he invested at all in the Republican platform, or was he much more his own candidate?
Nixon, this is a fascinating thing. Nixon was a fierce partisan. I mean, Harry Truman just could not stand Nixon. Truman was as partisan as Nixon. And Nixon savaged Democrats like Adlai Stevenson, Dean Acheson. Nixon, I lived in Wyoming, and there's a famous story about talking about Nixon's comeback. In the 1960s, Nixon showed up at a rally in Wyoming, a campaign rally, in October, when it was snowing, and no one thought he would, be there. He showed up and he drudged through the snow and gave a speech. That was one of the reasons he was able to get the nomination in '68, because he campaigned for Republicans. This is what he did all his life. He campaigned, and he knew every county chair, every state party, all of them. He was a party man, but the ironic thing was he detested the right wing. The conservatives loathed Nixon. There's a famous saying by a National Review author who said, "I never liked Nixon until Watergate." William F. Buckley, it was very clear that he never trusted Nixon. The right wing, correctly so, loathed him. And Nixon called the conservatives like Buckley the crazies, the kooks, the Birchites. He thought they were all Birchites. And when he was president, people like William Buckley, who went along with him to China, were aghast. And again, when they were looking at his administration, I mean, this is a guy where OSHA and the EPA is created. They're up in arms. So yes, he was a party man, but not an ideological one, which ironically is what hurt him. Because, unlike Donald Trump, the conservatives backed Trump in his impeachment. When Nixon needed the conservatives' help during Watergate, and you guys will remember, it was Barry Goldwater who went to the Oval Office and told him, "You got to go." Partisan, very. And that's where, this is where he made lifelong enemies, but the ironic thing was he attacked liberals viciously, but he almost, in some ways, had much more in common with them than the conservatives. You gotta. For the audience, Joe, there's a microphone. Yeah.
I'm inclined to regard Nixon's record as progressive favorably, but at the time, it seemed the atmosphere was more progressive. There was the John Birchers, and there were the anti-integrationists and all of that, but yet the sense I had was that the tide of the country was progressive, and I saw Nixon as fitting into it. I don't know if I gave him due credit for that at the time, because I was furious with him for other things.
Yes.
One was that when I was so young, I can barely remember, but it made a very strong impression on me, the McCarthy hearings, the anti-communism, the people who were destroyed by reckless rhetoric, opportunistic politicians. I saw Nixon as one of them who made his way over the corpses of those whom he destroyed, whom he killed. Now, whether he was right about Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers is only a piece of the story, because there was so much of it that was capitalizing on, opportunistically capitalizing on the anti-communism, the Red Scare. And the other thing about him that I find it hard to forgive, really, because I was again a young man and I had a draft card in my pocket, and my friends were going to Vietnam. I didn't finally have to go, but it made hell out of my life anyway for a number of years. The way he conducted himself during the Vietnam War, no, he didn't say, "I have a plan," but he did proceed as if he did, and everything he did, he said, was going to get the Vietnamese to the table. And he expanded the war. He carried out, at this time we knew that something was terribly wrong there, and he was just persevering in the wrongness. And during that time, his silent majority was not just a phrase, it was stoking the divisions in the country. And the divisions were fierce. People were fighting in the streets, the New York hard hats and so forth. Well, it was not a nice time. It's in actual violent behavior. I think it might, I haven't got this quantitatively, but it might have been worse than the violent behavior in recent years of partisanship. And he stoked it very cleverly with that silent majority business, so that everybody could feel righteous on his side, and the other guys were the hippies, you know? The people at the Miami for the nomination looked like you in a suit, and the people, for the other guys were grubby and had long hair and smoked pot and all of that, and so the silent majority could feel very righteous while they attacked them and sided with Nixon and so forth.
Yeah, you know, I wish you could have been in my class this morning, because Matt, you heard all of we played the silent, and that's exactly what I was saying. In his memoirs, Nixon writes, and I often ask my students to find the exact quote at this time, and if some of you could, he writes something like, looking back, my rhetoric at the time might have been overstated. This, Lydia, is when he's talking his memoirs about the 1950s, late 1940s. He said something that is just, there's no other way of putting it, it's repugnant. He said that Dean Acheson had a Ph.D. from the College of Cowardly Communist Containment. The man who created the structures of the Cold War, Dean Acheson, College of Cowardly Communist Containment. Did you find it, Lydia? No. Yeah. It's an RN, he's saying my rhetoric. His nastiness, he gave a speech in 1953 in which he said, he was talking about McCarthy, we have to shoot the rat, we have to know we're shooting the right rats. I mean, that kind of thing was just gross. And it was often called McCarthy in a white collar. You know, he was more subtle and everything. But when he ran in 50 against Helen Gahagan Douglas, he didn't need to go over the top. He was going to win anyway. He won by 680,000 votes. He didn't have to question Adlai Stevenson's patriotism. He didn't have to attack Dean Acheson. He didn't have to so furiously claim that Truman was really kind of covering up for Alger Hiss because, you know, maybe all the Democrats are traitors. And he did that. He would often say, well, I was kind of young and everything. Well, no. I mean, this is a guy who was a Navy veteran, a lawyer. He knew exactly, he wasn't some 29-year-old. And his rhetoric was, in those races, was over the top. With Vietnam, it's really, you know, counterfactual. What if he had said a month into his presidency, South Vietnam is a lost cause and let's pull out? I think, in my opinion, where Nixon, and this is going to be a difficult part of my book to write, was if Nixon believed that South Vietnam was not viable when he became president, did he allow 4 more years of fighting and dying? You know, that is, you know, if he did that, and like you said, he expanded in Cambodia and everything, that's a real troubling act. With the silent majority, I think it's partly a brilliant speech, but you're absolutely correct. He is dividing and conquering, because he's saying we're the majority, and what he's getting at, and I mentioned this in my class, we are patriotic, those people are not. Yeah. Oh, Robin, yeah.
I'm glad you recognize the nastiness. You know, that would be an interesting chapter in your book, focusing on the nastiness of the politics that Nixon excelled at, dividing people, insulting people, demonizing people, and how that, you know, resonates with Trumpism. You know, one glimmer of that nastiness that the Nixon tapes revealed, and this was really shocking to me, although I'm no Nixon fan, but when the Roe versus Wade decision came down about abortion, you know, Nixon said that he didn't think it was the right decision, but the one good thing about it is that black people will abort their children. I mean, Is there ever been a more racist statement by an American president than that?
When Franklin Roosevelt during World War II was discussing Jewish refugees, Roosevelt made a comment, Jews really were overrepresented in things like the legal profession and the doctor profession. And Roosevelt also put Japanese Americans in camps. That is overtly racist. There's also a conversation between Nixon and Reagan. Have you heard of that? Where they talk about the intelligence of, I think it's just Africans in general, correct? Black people, yeah. I mean, that's just absolutely racist. Nixon also said things that were anti-Semitic. No denying that, and not minimizing it. Now, one of the things that everything before the word but is nonsense, however, Father John, if you taped all your conversations for a couple of years, what might show up? Well, let's hope for Father John. Let's just say Father John, bad example. Okay. Incidentally, Nixon taped all of his conversations. He started it in February '71. Other presidents had taped it: Franklin Roosevelt, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson. Nixon started it, to show what a great president he was. The reason he taped all of his conversations is because the conversations in the Oval Office, EOB, phone, Camp David, were voice activated, because when they originally installed the Alexander Butterfield, and Murray Higbee installed the taping system, Nixon was supposed to hit record when he wanted to record and stop. He was such a klutz, he couldn't do it. I'm not making that up. He literally could not hit record and then stop. So they had to do a voice recorded system for him. Dr. Matter, you had the microphone. Yeah, right here. Yeah.
Well, Rob sort of asked the basis of my question, but I've always found it interesting as the older Nixon got, the more he wanted to come across as a statesman in public, very circumspect, more so when he was older than he was younger. We talked about some of the tough campaigning that he did when he was younger. But the contrast between that public Nixon, particularly as president, and then those private taped comments is unbelievable. It doesn't even seem like the same human being. How do you put those things together in a single personality?
Yeah, when the original batch of tapes came out, you remember he released the first batch in May of 1974 with expletive deleted? Yes, yes. Billy Graham came out and said they're shameful, immoral, and disgusting. This, I think, in something, there is just something so unseemly about Nixon sitting around in the Oval Office. We have a lawyer, Steve Sievers, is an attorney. Nixon was a lawyer, and he's sitting around the room with other attorneys, John Ehrlichman, Charles Colson, saying, how do we obstruct justice? How do we block an investigation? How do we pay people off? How do we keep people silent? This man's the president of the United States, and he's doing that. But I think what bothered people even more, and what really disappointed Nixon's supporters, people who had voted for him, was what you guys are getting at. It was just the vulgarity and so unbecoming a president the things that he said on tape just, maybe a person like this shouldn't be president. You know, someone this full of anger, rage, hate, and these things isn't fit. And you could certainly say the absolute same thing about Lyndon Johnson. And you could make a very good case that probably, yeah, they weren't fit to be. I mean, you look at how their presidencies turned out. There's a little funny story, a little anecdote. Talk about expletive deleted. In 1960, Harry Truman said that anyone who votes for Nixon could go to hell. And Nixon came out and said, "How dare he use language like that?" I would never see, yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of it had to do, again, I'm not a Freudian, or are there any psychiatrists here? Well, a lot of it had to do, again, with his mother. A lot of people come out when he said, you know, I'm not a crook. He was really talking to his parents, you know, his mom in particular. I'm not a crook. And when he was in the public, he was such a good person. And again, in his going away statement, he said, my mother was a saint. And yet in private, he was saying things that his mother literally would. His mother never swore. His mother never. And yet, so there was this contrast. How do you reconcile this? One of his aides, William Safire, said Nixon could walk into an office and don a personality. In other words, he could walk into an office with Queen Elizabeth and not be charming, but be very correct. And then he can go to an office when Charles Colson says, how do we fix these bastards? It's very difficult. The anger drove him clearly and then destroyed him.
You know, the most important question, looking at this from a contemporary lens, is not about the personal shortcomings of Nixon. We've had a lot of presidents with a lot of shortcomings, or even the nastiness or the hatred. But the most pressing question when we think about today is, like, okay, Watergate hits, he has Republican support, he's just won in a landslide election. So he's got a lot of popular support. But you have a press that's very different in 1972, 73 than it is now.
How so?
He does not have Fox News.
Well, Rob, this is where I would counter you.
Bullshit every day,
no, Rob.
Taking whatever he says and turning it into truth for the American people. All the lies, all the deception, all the misstatements, everything from his own perspective. You know,
no, we're going to disagree.
He doesn't
here.
have a right-wing media that he can rely upon for whatever happens.
He had a liberal media that was out to get him. He did. I mean, contrast how the press treated Kennedy versus how they treated him. Now, Nixon was paranoid. That doesn't mean that the establishment didn't hate him. They did. They looked down upon him as this kid runt from Whittier, who went to Whittier.
Yeah.
I mean, the Washington Post, Brent Bradley was a Boston Brahmin. He looked upon Nixon as, he said when Nixon got elected, it's like the Nazis occupying Paris. The New York Times didn't like Nixon. The Washington Post didn't like him. They did treat him differently than they had treated Democratic politicians. I would argue, and I'm going to argue, that his anger toward the press was completely justified. Now, he was stupid enough to get involved in Watergate. But taking the 1960 election, the networks and the major newspapers were all for Kennedy, and Nixon was bitter about that.
Sure.
I think that's justifiably so.
And
part of the reason there is a Fox News is because I wrote another book on Spiro Agnew. That Agnew attacked the media, and a lot of conservatives said, yes, they're out to give us the shaft. Now, you and I don't see eye to eye on this, but I would contend that when you have an establishment press that is all completely lined up against Nixon, I'll give you one final thing on this. Nixon got how much percent of the vote today, Madeline, in 1972? Remember he got over 60%? Yeah. Over 90% of journalists in Washington, D.C. voted for McGovern.
So he lived in a world where he had MSNBC, but he didn't have Fox News. He didn't have one of the major networks from his perspective defending him all the time.
No, that's true. In fact, the only conservative outlets were all like National Review were detesting it.
If he had had Fox News, would he have even been? Would he be?
You know, I think you could make the case now that I'll consider that. I'll consider that. Oh, one of the things I forgot to mention was one of the things in 1960. This is a little anecdote. I like anecdotes. I'm going to include a lot. No one ever believes this, but in the 1960 election, more women voted for Nixon than Kennedy, 51 to 48. It's really an extraordinary thing. It's one of the things that, again, Nixon, he was extremely bitter about 1960. The gender gap comes in with Reagan, not with Nixon. And I also wrote an article saying if there is a Southern strategy, it was Reagan who really did it. Because it was Reagan, Dr. Ward, who went to Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1980, deliberately so. Ronald Reagan went in 1980 to Philadelphia, Mississippi, the site of a murder in 1964 of civil rights activists. And in 1980, Reagan talked about states' rights. Well, yes, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier that he liked to remember a lot.
He remembered, yes, he remembered it.
And then you said he used phrasing he doesn't recall. Do you
Yes.
think that hurt him?
Yeah, I mean, see, yes, I'll tell you why. Because when Nixon said things during Watergate, like, I don't recall, or I'm not sure, or I didn't know about what I might, people looked at him and said, you're lying. You know everything, you remember everything. Whereas in Ronald Reagan and Iran-Contra, when Reagan said, I don't know anything, people were like, well, yeah. I mean, literally. I mean, and again, or I don't recall, well, you're Ronald, yeah. Not making this up. I mean, one of Reagan's defenses in Iran-Contra was, I really wasn't in charge, because he really wasn't. And if you didn't remember it, Reagan didn't call this cabinet secretary of his Mr. Mayor. It does kind of help to be dumb in some situations. Nixon, when he said, I'm not a crook, people looked at him and said, well, yeah, you are. I mean, he couldn't use that as a defense. Nixon could never say, I didn't know everything. This is a man who was in charge of every aspect of his administration. He even tried to get the White House guards to dress like Prussian military in Prussian military uniforms of the 19th century, who changed the China. I mean, literally. So Nixon could never say, I didn't know or I can't remember, because neither thing was true. And that actually did hurt him. He talked about how hands-on he was, and then when Watergate comes along, well, everyone, well, okay. It did hurt him. Yes.
Thank you. This is half an observation and half a question that I think would be very hard to answer. I remember, it goes back to the media and the question of how we get our information and how we form a common reality. Back when Johnson was president and things were going so badly for him over Vietnam, Walter Cronkite got on television one night and said, folks, we're in the wrong war. And Johnson said, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the country. Something like that.
Right.
Close enough. And when an impeachment came up shortly after, not Johnson's impeachment, but Nixon's, there was still a common reality, so much so that Republicans could have been part of the impeachment process, agreeing that Nixon had done some terribly wrong things. And it was still because, I think, we still had some idea of a common reality. And we could look at the politics together and say, whether you like Nixon or not, this is wrong. What he did here was wrong. But today, we have an impeachment, and look at how that broke down in partisan terms. And is it because, at least in part, that we no longer have a common reality? We've decided that we have to have two realities?
Well, I think that this does date back. Again, I was talking in my class today. When Nixon nominated Clemens Haynsworth for the Supreme Court and got rejected, then nominated Carswell, that got rejected. That began in the conservative movement. Just, we've got to fight back here. Then when you saw Robert Bork being rejected, then the Clarence Thomas hearings, then the Kavanaugh hearings, and then when Biden nominates the Supreme Court nominee, you saw what happened. These battles have become so ideological and so pitched, but also so personal, that it's impossible right now to have a shared reality, because both sides are saying, you did it worse than we did. So we're almost going to up the ante. And so, beginning with like Clinton's impeachment, I mean, you remember how vicious, I remember how vicious the Clinton wars were. I mean, they were really, but the Democrats said, we're going to stick with Clinton. Whereas almost every Republican voted to impeach. The ideological breakdown has affected the parties so that today there are no more Nelson Rockefellers at all. There are no conservative Democrats. So a William Cohn, who was a Republican from Maine, who voted to impeach him, he was on the Judiciary Committee, just that does not exist anymore.
In reality, at least enough overlap so that we can still talk with one another.
Yeah, I do think that that's an unfortunate thing. You talked about in the 1960s, there was a clearly generational divide, and people, I heard my family had arguments over Vietnam, and your father would yell at his son and everything. But the fact that today that you can't be friends with someone who you disagree with politically, to me is very troubling. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Ward.
So there are historians like Gordon Wood who say that George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, when they were writing, they were very cognizant that the eyes of history would be on them.
Yes.
And I think James Oakes and others would argue the same thing with Lincoln or Johnson or Grant. And you could sort of get any genre of historian, and they'd pick out their president. They're all quite sure that they were aware the eyes of history upon them, and every little thing that they write, it's for the generations as much as it is for the moment. And it seems like Nixon is going down that pathway as well. Like he's recording everything, he's writing everything down, but at the same time, he's aware of this hyper-partisanized atmosphere that he's existing in, and he's very antagonistic towards the media. Let's, if we can, live in a fantasy where Watergate didn't happen for a moment. Let's pretend that Nixon gets his full 2 terms. He's writing everything down. He's recording everything. What is he trying to do? What's his legacy? If he believes the eyes of history are upon him, what does he want history to see in him?
The first thing would be something that he was a statesman. And he said in his first inaugural, the greatest title anyone could confirm is that of a peacemaker. And again, that comes from his mother. I'm not a Freudian, but Nixon, Hannah was a Quaker. And you have this whole, Nixon does have this ideal, I want to be the peacemaker. He also believed that he could change the world in a way, reorient the post-World War II, that you would not have a Cold War, but at the same point in time, he could play China and the Soviet Union off against each other. He believed that he could have effected a Middle East peace. He truly believed that. At home, he actually really believed, he thought that he could build a coalition, not just of white Southerners, traditional Republicans, but on the silent majority, he thought the group that would later become known as Reagan Democrats. Because Nixon never really cared about economics, he thought that the real issue were these people were shown an extraordinary disrespect, like me. You know, I was this poor kid. He wasn't that poor, but the workers from Pennsylvania, he could bring them in and create a permanent, and he talked about this, a permanent governing majority. Finally, in terms of history, he wanted to go down as someone who exceeded Dwight Eisenhower, Truman, his recent predecessors. And it galled him that Kennedy was ranked all he just carried around the rest of his life. That unlike all of them, he had actually created change. That's what he was really looking at. In February of 1973, all of that looked possible. His approval ratings were 68%. He had won this tremendous re-election, but in his first term, he had worked very well with Congress. The economy was very strong in 1973. It really did look like he was going to be one of the greatest presidents. Finally, and he began talking about this, he began to see himself, literally, as he began to make plans for after I'm president, I'm going to return to California and be kind of the world statesman. People will come to my house. He had this grandiose vision that he was going to be the world's elder statesman. Didn't quite work out. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
You mentioned about the EPA and the OSHA.
Yeah.
And I remember reading that he was trying to be as conservative as possible for himself, but as liberal or progressive as needed be. So would he approve OSHA and EPA? Did he do it out of his own, like he personally believed in that, or just to satisfy?
See, this is one of the contentious issues. Like Tom Wicker and Joan Hoff, the books I'm in, a lot of writers write, he did these things for the wrong reasons. He did the right things for the wrong reasons. First of all, it was to spite liberals. Second, it was just politically. He saw there was this Earth Day, and he saw this as a movement. Well, I'll get on top of it. I'll create the EPA. That he supported this thing called black capitalism, and directed that he was maybe just trying to create a separate black economy. Again, those books there, the John Farrell book takes the view that any of these things, it was just cynical and about politics, and that he was opportunistic. There's another argument here, that Nixon had no core. That he simply didn't believe in anything. That he was a cynical opportunist in a way that Barry Goldwater believed that he was. Barry Goldwater was a man of his convictions. Reagan was a man of his convictions. McGovern, Lyndon Johnson. They believed, McGovern and Johnson, two very different individuals, believed in the liberal state. Goldwater and Reagan were conservatives, whereas Nixon was essentially at his own core hollow. There's a further, Nixon had virtually no friends. Bebe Rebozo, that no one loved Nixon. But at his core, What did he believe? Was the anti-communism a cynical ploy? Because, I mean, after all, this is the guy who does go to China. I was reading about William McKinley. It was said that McKinley had his ear so close to the ground he could hear like the grass. Nixon was a shrewd politician who knew which way the winds were blowing, to borrow a term. But he had no ideology. Now, is that a lack of character? Or does it show a politician who can actually get things done because he worked with Congress? You can read about it in my book, which side I take. One more question?
Going back to Russia and China, or the Soviet Union for that matter, I believe that he went over and he spoke, and he asked them what...
Say that again?
I believe that he went over and asked the Chinese what they think of their Soviet counterparts. Could you shed some information about what they thought? Or
Well, in 1969, when Nixon was taking office, Russia and the Soviet Union were having a border war. The Soviet Union and China. Yeah, the Soviet Union and China were having a border war. And Brezhnev kind of sent a back-channel message to Nixon, would you consider using nuclear weapons with us against China? In May of 1972, you recall when Nixon mined the harbors in Haiphong? He mined the harbors in Haiphong. Some of the mines blew up a ship with Soviet sailors on it. I believe 7 were killed. The Soviets formally protested and then just utterly ignored it. The Soviets were desperate to get some sort of deal because of the grain wheat. They also knew they were spending too much on the military, hence the limitation. They were mostly terrified you're making a deal with China. Mao had absolutely contempt for Leonid Brezhnev and the Soviet leadership by this point. The Chinese, one of the reasons they were so receptive to these overtures was because of this rivalry they had with the Soviet Union. Because the Chinese viewed the Soviets as kind of the power in decline, and they were going to be the red power rising, which they turned out to be fairly accurate. One more, anyone? I'll take one more. Any? Well, thank you very much. Thank you.